In his celebrated 1869 history of Elizabethtown, Kentucky, James Haycraft's grandson, Samuel Haycraft, Jr., included some biographical sketches of Hardin County's prominent early families. In regard to his own, Haycraft asserted that his grandfather was a seaman in the Royal Navy who arrived in America about 1740, adding, "How he happened to stay, none living can now tell." Speculating that grandfather James either took French leave, that is, deserted, or was discharged, he remarked that one way or the other his immigrant ancestor liked the looks of the country, and concluded to make it his own. In 1878, this version of the family's New World origins was perpetuated in a sketch about James's son, Samuel Haycraft Sr., which was published in the Biographical Encyclopedia of Kentucky. However, this version is not accurate. Whether Samuel Haycraft Jr. was truly ignorant of the actual circumstances that led to his English grandfather's arrival in America, or was simply trying to protect his family's good name, is uncertain. Whatever the case, it is a shame that he didn't know, or wouldn't tell, what really happened, for it is quite an interesting story. It appears that James Haycraft Jr. was born in London in 1719. In any event, the parish register of St. Andrew's Church in Holborn records the christening of a child by that name on December 19th of that year. The infant's father was also named James Haycraft, or Haycroft, as it was also spelled sometimes. His mother's given name was Hannah. Her maiden surname is unknown. Although severely damaged by German bombs during World War II, St. Andrew's, one of several London churches designed by Sir Christopher Wren, was rebuilt and is still standing to this day at Holborn Circus. At about the time he reached adulthood, James Haycraft met a young woman named Anne Henley, or Henry. Anne would later claim that she and James were married at the town of Malden in Kent, about 1741. This is curious, however, most of all because there is no town Malden in Kent. There is, however, a town called Malden, spelled with an O instead of an E, in Essex. Perhaps the court clerk made a mistake, or possibly Anne misspoke. There is also the possibility that Anne lied, and that the couple's relationship was instead what is better known as a common law arrangement. In 1744, during the reign of King George II, James Haycraft and Anne Henley were living together as man and wife in St. Margaret's Parish, Westminster, in a dwelling located at Angel Court, Storey's Gate, close by Westminster Abbey. Modern-day visitors to London will find that Angel Court no longer exists, but Storey's Gate still leads to the southeast corner of St. James's Park, just as it did in the mid-18th century. St. Margaret's Church also still stands, immediately adjacent to Westminster Abbey, and not far from where the two young people resided. At this time, James Haycraft made his living as a chimney sweep. A fellow sweep, Samuel Smithman, lived in nearby Petty France Street with a young woman named Elizabeth Eaton. From all accounts, Haycraft and Smithman met in late 1743 or early 1744, and in short order the two couples became friends. Life was hard for the working poor in Georgian London, particularly chimney sweeps, who were poorly paid, worked in dangerous conditions, and whose hands, face, and clothing seemed to be perpetually coated with black soot. Moreover, the work was seasonal. In order to make a living in the summer months, sweeps oftentimes chose to be nightmen, engaged in emptying privies, which was not an especially pleasant task. Although these circumstances do not excuse what happened, they certainly go a long way toward explaining why James Haycraft and his friends turned to a life of crime. In late March 1744, Haycraft and Smithman decided that they would burglarize a shop owned by William and Anne Griffiths. If Smithman's testimony can be trusted, it was not their first such job. The location of the Griffiths' shop is uncertain, but it was probably situated in Westminster, where the robbers lived, or Holborn, where they fenced the stolen goods afterwards. Smithman later claimed that Anne Henley originally proposed the scheme, whereas she said that the robbery was Smithman's idea. In any case, it seems clear that the motive was simply to obtain far more money than either Smithman or Haycraft could earn legally by sweeping chimneys, selling soot, or cleaning privies. At about 10 o'clock on the night of Thursday, 5th of April, 1744, Old Style, Haycraft used a hammer to break the lock that secured the door of Griffiths' shop. Acting as lookouts, the two women waited outside in the street while their so-called husbands took their time looting the shop. Apparently, no one disturbed them because it was not until after midnight that the two men finally emerged, carrying either a trunk or a sack full of penknives, belt buckles, cheap jewelry, and a variety of similar items, which they initially took to Smithman and Eaton's residence on Petty France. At about 4 o'clock in the morning of April the 6th, Anne Griffiths later testified, "She was called up to find my shop broke open and that she and her husband had been robbed." Later that day, she somehow learned that Haycraft and Smithman had given away some of the stolen goods. This prompted the Griffiths to obtain a search warrant from a Justice Paulson. That same day, apparently, the youthful thieves went to Holborn, over against Gray's Inn's gate, where they first tried to sell the stolen goods to a stall holder for 20 shillings. Rejecting an offer of only 8 shillings, Eaton and Henley next approached a shopkeeper named Francis Whiting, telling him that they had some hardware to sell. He agreed to meet them later in a nearby alehouse. When Whiting arrived, Haycraft and Smithman were there as well. Probably over drinks, he agreed to give the four young people 17 shillings 6 for the stolen items, an amount they accepted and promptly divided among themselves, share and share alike. At the same meeting, Whiting asked if they had any wipes, meaning handkerchiefs. If they had, Eaton later testified, they were to come back to the alehouse on Wednesday, and Whiting would buy of them and give them as much as anybody would. Armed with a search warrant, a parish constable named Thomas Rawlins discovered the stolen goods in Whiting's shop window in Holborn. After Anne Griffiths identified the items stolen from her shop, Whiting and the four robbers were apprehended and taken to Newgate Prison, located on the site of today's Central Criminal Courts building, which is popularly known as the Old Bailey. Ironically, the place of their incarceration was probably only a short distance from the tavern where they met Whiting, and also not very far from the church where James was christened in 1719. Of the British capital's 14 prisons, Newgate was the most ancient and notorious, known to Londoners as hell above ground. Prisoners awaiting trial had heavy iron manacles clapped on their hands and feet, and were thrust into the hold, a dark room with a stone floor which was entered by a hatch measuring 15 by 20 feet. Inside was a single barrack bed on which a prisoner could sleep if they could stand the smell. Disorderly prisoners were chained to ring bolts placed around the room, from which they would be released, provided they were willing and able to pay a fee to the jailer or turnkey. Removal of the manacles also required the payment of a fee. Fortunately for the four young burglars, justice was reasonably swift. On 12 April 1744, they were questioned by Justice Paulson, who They each confessed their role in the crime. Although at first Haycraft claimed that he and Smithman had found the items in a trunk while on their way home from an early morning sweeping job. At their subsequent trial, which was held on 10 May 1744, William and Ann Griffiths, Thomas Rawlins, and Francis Whiting testified against them. Although some of their own statements at the trial were contradictory, there seems no doubt that all four young people were guilty as charged, and not surprisingly, Haycraft and Smithman were so found, as was Eaton. Whiting was bound over for trial at the next session for receiving those goods, knowing them to be stolen. Surprisingly, Anne Henley was acquitted. However, she was not immediately released, but kept in custody to be evidenced against Whiting at his trial, at which he was also acquitted on 28 July that same year, after several character witnesses attested to his honesty. What became of Henley afterwards is a mystery. There seems to be no evidence she ever left England. As punishment for their crimes, Haycraft, Smithman, and Eaton, along with several other petty criminals, were sentenced to 7 years' transportation to America. They were fortunate. 5 people who stood trial at the same court session were sentenced to death, no doubt by hanging. One, Joseph Griswold, was sentenced to 14 years' transportation. Another, Robert Kerr, was branded, or burnt in the hand. Although criminals had been transported to America as early as the mid-17th century, it was not until after the Transportation Act was passed by Parliament in 1718 that the sentence of 7 years' transportation to the American colonies became the standard punishment for crimes other than the most trivial or most heinous. For both Britain and America, transportation was a multiple blessing. By siphoning off Britain's surplus population, the practice of taking the worst elements in the country across the Atlantic to America not only relieved the pressure on overcrowded penal institutions, it also decreased the heavy expense of poor relief. At the same time, it provided colonial planters, particularly in Virginia and Maryland, with an abundant and unfailing source of free labor to be provided by able-bodied men and women and children to whom the planter had no contractual obligations during their terms of service. Altogether, it is estimated that some 50,000 men, women, and children, most of whom belonged to the poorest class, and were sentenced for crimes which today might incur a small fine or probation, were transported to America before 1775. In May 1744, probably at Blackfriars Bridge, Haycraft was taken in chains aboard the Justitia, the vessel that would take him and his fellow convicts to America. Altogether, 25 people were sentenced to transportation in Middlesex County Court between February and May 1744. Although we cannot be certain, it is probable that all were transported aboard the Justitia. As the Justitia, one of 2 flagships of the convict fleet, the other was the Trial, sailed down the River Thames towards the sea, it seems unlikely that James Haycraft and his fellow transportees, no doubt chained together in a dark, dank hole below decks, were able to take a last look at their English homeland. One cannot help but wonder what James was thinking as the voyage began. Did he think he might return to London someday? He didn't. Was Anne Henley, the wife, the hapless young chimney sweep, was forced to leave behind in his thoughts? Surely she must have been. And did Anne likewise think of James as she sat in a Newgate prison cell, knowing that the last time they would probably ever see one another was in the courtroom? Unfortunately, we are left only to imagine. Although the situation in which he found himself was unfortunate, to say the least, James Haycraft probably did not know that it could have been far worse. On 17 April 1744, at the same time James and his friends were sitting in Newgate awaiting trial, the previous captain of the Justitia, Barrett Bond, was himself brought to trial on 4 counts of murder on the high seas. The charge stemmed from a voyage a little more than a year earlier when 163 convicted felons and indentured servants were brought aboard. The ill treatment they received at the hands of Bond during the voyage to America resulted in no less than 45 deaths. Remarkably, despite a preponderance of evidence against him, the sadistic captain was acquitted. But he never again worked in the transportation trade, at least in England. Afterward, Bond went to America, where he died in Maryland a few years later. Jack Campbell, about whom nothing is known, was Bond's replacement as captain of the Justitia when the vessel crossed the Atlantic in the spring of 1744. Whether he treated his unwilling passengers any better or any worse than his predecessor, it's hard to say. In either event, we know that James Haycraft and Samuel Smithman survived the voyage, which lasted from 6 to 8 weeks, because they both have descendants living in the United States today. What became of Elizabeth Eaton is unknown. Although official records only name America as its destination, at the end of the voyage, the Justitia probably anchored at Chesapeake Bay, off the Virginia shore. There, at some unnamed port, Campbell set about ridding himself of his unfortunate passengers, selling them at auction to the highest bidder, undoubtedly to be used in most cases as laborers on tobacco plantations, until the expiration of the term of their sentence. The way this was accomplished was described in the Old Bailey Sessions papers. They are placed together in a row, like so many oxen or cows, and the planters come and survey them, and if they like them, they agree for price with the person entrusted with the selling of them. And after they have paid the money, they ask him if they like him for master and is willing to go with him. If they answer in the affirmative, they are delivered to him as his property. If, on the contrary, as sometimes happen, they should answer in the negative, the planter has his money again, and another planter may make choice of him, who he may likewise refuse, but no more, for with the third, it seems, he is obliged to go, whether he likes him or not. As there are frequently people who run away from their masters, there is a reward of 20 shillings paid for the taking of them, which makes it very difficult for him to escape. Some researchers believe that James Haycraft was indentured first to George Neville, a planter who in 1743 obtained 181 acres of land in Prince William County. In 1759, George Neville's land became part of newly formed of Fauquier County. Later, Haycraft's master reportedly became George's son John, who after reaching adulthood and getting married, moved west to neighboring Frederick County, for where a time he served as sheriff. It appears that James Haycraft was himself married either just before or just after his indenture expired in 1751, at which time he was about 32 years of age. Together, he and his unknown wife in America had 4 children, 1 daughter who died in infancy, and 3 sons, James, Samuel, and Joshua. Our only evidence of his presence in Frederick County is the will of a man named James Taylor, which James Haycraft witnessed on 18 October 1760. After James and his wife died about 1762, John Neville took the 3 boys into his household and cared for them until they reached their majority.